gives you the option to opt out. All right. Okay, so today's discussion is on costly signaling and Fisherian runaways. So that's it's a very interesting topic that first let's break it down into just costly signaling, what that means. So we can think of signals and costly signals as the cost is a way to create to show an honesty in what is being signaled. So something a high cost signal basically creates a correlation between what you see and what it's trying to signify. So you could see this in the colors of a male songbird. You could even think of large philanthropic donations doing this. If a very wealthy person makes an enormous donation as a way to signal their benefactor status, that's going to matter more than if it was only $100. So the act is the same in many ways. So this is a very interesting dynamic that shows up in nature, and we can think of it as all in the ways that it shows up in human behavior as well and culture. But because there is this disconnect between the signal and what is being signaled, and despite costs acting as a kind of constraint, a correlation between the two, because the signal is what's visible and not the actual signified in every case, you can get what Fisher came up with of Fisherian runaways, and has been, there are other terms for it, but I like that way it rolls off the tongue, in that the signal itself becomes actually the fixation, the what is being selected for. And so you can get you see this in sexual selection, for traits in male animals, and the ways that they are basically trying to appeal to females in increasingly dramatic ways, far beyond any, signal that may be needed. The signal is there, but it just keeps getting selected for. And in many ways, when we think of how costly signals kind of come in our own life and how much we use signaling of various kinds to communicate something that we want others to know about us, it can quickly become overwhelmed to the point that the signal is the point, basically, and it can run away in that way, so that now whatever underlying trait was important is kind of secondary. And so I leave that in a certain sort of vague. I don't want to pin it down because I want to have our time be to explore, thinking about some of these questions. Are there signals in our lives that feel increasingly disconnected from the quality they are meant to convey? And where do we find ourselves more focused on the form of the representation than the thing itself? So with that, I see we have a queue here. So let's go to Andy and go from there. Andy.
Yeah, I just want to ask if anybody knows the etymology of the word prestige. It actually comes from illusion. Right. If you look it up, it's quite it's like prestidigitation, illusionism.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's also interesting because prestige is a social signal, from how I understand it. So someone has prestige because others think of them as basically a prestigious, important person. So you know that someone's prestigious based off of what other people look at them like. So it's interesting to think of something that's that dependent on others and their views, that it is kind of this like illusion of what's the substance? How do I actually know? You don't know. It's indirect. Rob. I feel like we're doing a call-in show now.
I was thinking about the Sacklers or the Sattlers, the pharma people who were giving wings on museums all the time. And I presume that the cost, which was quite high in my terms, was to pay for covering up their malfeasance in terms of the opioid crisis. And I wonder how that plays out in terms of cost and benefit, and whether that's an example of a runaway, because they've had, they're getting their name removed from all these museums. So maybe it became dysfunctional.
It's a good example, and a good example also of that signal flows into the museums as well, and they might not have wanted the signal anymore, signaled something bad for them as well. Diane?
Yeah, just a couple of random thoughts. One of them is that the examples of Fisherian runaways seem to be in the literature, seem to be mostly physical kinds of things, like the plumage kind of thing, and so it can be a basis for selection for inheritance. But a lot of what we're talking about in human behavior is actually probably cultural, or at least interpersonal. And so the question becomes, what are we selecting? Because in the case of the peacock, what you get is a bigger and bigger tail, which presumably is an honest signal because it's a burden on the animal. So it still has to be pretty healthy to carry all that around. But to do something deliberately, like the sacklers, seems quite a different problem. In other words, to go back to trust that we were talking about before, it seems that these costly signals are a way of engendering trust in other people. So, I mean, at the physical level, yes, you can inherit a tendency to prefer something that's an honest signal, but is that what's going on in social life? Would be my first question.
That's great, Diane. Thank you. And two things that come to mind there is that I love this question, and I'd like to add it to our thinking of what are we selecting for, and in these human versions. And there's kind of two things that come to mind of that I'll offer. One is, in the case of the sacklers, we could think of them in a kind of very typical Darwinian sense of that they're trying to spread their cultural traits, their cultural influence. So it's very goal-oriented, directed behavior. It's not naturally selected, but they are basically trying to spread the amount of people in the world that think that the sacklers are a good name. On the other hand, selection occurs, I think, more to the point of most I think cultural evolution is driven by the selection of who we choose as models. So we're selecting from all of the people we could learn from all of the sources of information we could consume, which ones do we pick? And we can't know the value of it outright, and so we are desperately reliant on signals of all kinds to decide who to learn from. And prestige was mentioned, success and all these various things. So in that sense, we're selecting for our models, and so what's being signaled are ways to bias from the position of the sacklers themselves as a model, or from our position, who's a good model to select from.
Can I add just one more sentence?
Please.
Which is that in anthropology, there's a very well-known example of the potlatch. So that would need to be in the mix.
Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, just in?
Well, it was a prestige competition, apparently. The leader who could, afford somehow to waste the most stuff was the one who had the highest prestige. But is that role modeling?
Well, I mean, in the sense that the prestige, by them being prestigious, means that they will have more influence. So it's indirect, but does bias things in their way. They are being
Yeah.
selected via that prestige. Steve, do you have something you want to add here?
Yeah, I had two thoughts. One is in terms of keeping things clean conceptually, it seems to me that we might want to make a distinction between signaling in the Fisherian sense of sexual selection versus signaling that goes on socially but isn't really about sexual selection. So I was thinking about virtue signaling, which is a way of seeking social approval or status, but isn't at least directly really part of sexual selection. And I think it might be important when we talk about signaling to think about which bucket type of signaling we're discussing. Now, admittedly, there's some overlap because status recognition is particularly in our species, is related to sexual success, et cetera. The second thought I had was I was thinking about how this applies to our own species, and I was trying to think about what male behavior that is selected for by sexual selection in our species that might have been a product of a runaway. And the thought that occurred to me was the male ego. And I'll explain why I came up with that. We do know that that faking self-confidence actually increases success in most endeavors in life, including in mating. So to the degree that women are selecting men that seem confident and strong and ambitious, and to the degree that men are able to sort of convince themselves they have more abilities than they really do, maybe the inflated male ego is a product in some way of runaway selection in our own species.
It's a great example. Thanks, Steve. And just to ask as a follow-up, I think it's helpful to distinguish kind of what process this sort of signaling is happening in. Are we actually talking about a sexual selection process versus any of these other sort of less defined processes, maybe cultural selection? I think that's key, because what you just said there is actually, I think, a great example of something that you could argue has emerged from sexual selection over biological history. That being said, do you think, it's an open question, but first to you, Steve, that there's the process that we're talking about here of the signaled, and the runaway potentiality? To me, that's kind of like the more general thing that's happening. We can distinguish sort of in what process,
Yeah, I guess the positive feedback loop could happen in either bucket, to go back to my distinction. I think the distinction really is, what is the goal of the signaling?
Yeah.
Is the goal sexual success, or is the goal social approval or status? And again, I say that with the caveat that status is not unrelated to sexual success, but I still think the conceptual distinction makes sense and is worth keeping in mind.
All right, that's a helpful question to have in our mind as we think of examples of like what's the goal of this signaling process, which will help us distinguish that. Thanks, Steve. Hank.
Hi, nice to see you all. Since getting your email, I've been looking at material that I'm not very familiar with, and it has to do with biology and evolutionary biology. So I'm going to be a little more literal, summarize the little that I know. We're talking about cultural niche construction and cultural human cumulative knowledge, how that modifies selection and modifies the genome and affects the evolutionary outcome. So I don't know, I imagine there are people who know more about this than me, but that's what I was able to kind of summarize. And then thinking about when we're talking about humans, and not thinking only about sexual selection, but this this affecting the genome and expressing signaling, and that being codified in the genes. So just want to mention that's how I'm thinking about it now, and appreciating all the other comments.
Yeah, the niche construction piece is a very interesting layer to add. It's pretty heady though.
Yeah,
On top of all of the signaling, the niche that is being constructed around the signal. But it's there. That's
right.
something to think about. But I think when we think of niche construction, it's just there's like basically our actions are shaping the environment, as well. We're not just simply fitting ourselves to the environment. Often we're shaping the environment to ourselves as well, and that's the big definition of niche construction. So I think that you could think of how these runaways or just these signaling processes create niches basically for they necessitate the signal back onto itself basically.
So I was thinking one more on that. I was thinking about a lot of work is being done on the generational transmission of trauma over 3 or more generations. So I'm starting to think about that in terms of niche construction. And is it just a marker on a gene? Is it a genetic marker, this signaling, or is it a mutation in the gene, and which takes a lot longer? So that would be the other facet that I've been paying attention to.
Sure, but it's also the environment. The niche.
Yeah.
The niche is all of the above. Yeah, it just reflects some affected process, some subset of what the environment is that's been changed. So you grow up in a home, that's a different niche, even though the neighbors next to you are also basically in the same environment. If they don't have that trauma, that's not really part of it. But the genetic piece of it certainly comes through, and the epigenetics is
Paige,
also
not only that, but every sibling has a different niche within that one
Yeah.
home too.
Right. But one more thing, Sage, is that are we talking about, let's say, Steve, you mentioned the sort of, we'll call the macho male signaling. Now, is that been is there a genetic mutation or genetic marker about that? And then the receiver of the signal, is that already genetically established? And if we're thinking about affecting that, like toxic masculinity, misogyny, racism, are we talking about genetic issues, not just human cultural ones that we might intervene with?
I'd have to think that it is genetic, but whether that doesn't mean the gene's been identified. And
No.
the way to change it would be to change female preference for what type of males they want.
But if that's genetic, how do we modify the gene? I'm sorry.
Well, I suppose with cultural change, and my guess is it would be really interesting anthropologically to look at, has female sexual preference, what characteristics they seek, how does that vary culture to culture, and how does it vary across historical time? I'm sure there have been cultural changes, which probably have some genetic sequelae to them.
Well, think about the way, just to go back to the relation of our genetic inheritance, that I certainly buy this idea that Steve has put forth around the sexual selection of our species. But think about the niches that we construct and have constructed. It's always changed from, maybe it was the gladiators at one point, maybe now it's professional athletes or, high status positions, the corner office. There's all sorts of ways that we basically have somebody who recognizes this pressure, is able to culturally create the means by which they can, respond to it, even if they themselves would, in a different context, maybe not really be seen as, fitting that. So I think even despite the fact that there's a strong biological and genetic piece to this, it's always changing. So let's put a pin on that too, because I want to hear from Rob and Kathleen and Eveline. So Rob?
It just occurred to me that Freud would probably say that all signaling is sexual and there's no distinction. But I wanted to go back to the potlatch because I thought of that before, and it seemed like an interesting concept, because the purpose of the potlatch is to redistribute wealth. I mean, if the function of it seems to be, the big man accumulates a lot of wealth and then has a big party and shares it, and it redistributes the wealth to the rest of the community. So it has this leveling function that I think
Mhm.
that is trustworthy, and it is signaling to people that the person who's arranged this party is a good one. But the actual effect is also good. So
That reminds me of what I remember reading in The Secret of Our Success by Joe Henrich about but the function of prestige is a itself an honest signal, because it comes from how other people look at it, and to be prestigious is kind of synonymous with having done good for others, so your prestige comes from the fact that you have this positive influence on other people, as opposed to high status by dominance, for example, which would be the opposite in many ways. Kathleen?
Well, I was going to make a comment similar to the one that Rob just made. I appreciated what Diane brought up in the very beginning. She mentioned trust. And I do think that in human culture, that especially at this stage, we've moved away from more biologically based genetic preferences that are involved in, sexual selection. And not even, and the cultural selection is even maybe a little more intense than virtue selection, but more like power. And there's an innate link between power and trust, and that people can convey power, but they may not be trustworthy in terms of what their intentions are. And you can look at somebody like Donald Trump, who has had a lot of money and power, and he's signaling something very significant in terms of cultural choices. But there's also larger social polarization, because many people don't trust what he's signaling, but a lot of others do. So I didn't have a chance to read much in the Wikipedia article about this particular topic, but it is fascinating. And I do think that there's something there in terms of human culture. There's runaway influences that are related to our inherent need to trust one another in order to build cohesive, civilized society, and the mismatch between what people can signal when they have power and money, a manifestation, a reflection of the impact of capitalism on human culture and the environment at this point, the very balance of life itself, and choices that people make. And there's a link between the trust, power, and identity. So just to kind of pull it back a little bit into pro-social or design principles, who we are.
Very well put, Kathleen. Thank you. Rob, did you have a quick response to that, or something new?
no, sorry, I forgot to take my hand down.
Okay. Eveline, you're next on our queue.
Thanks. Yeah, this is an interesting conversation. I mean, the part about for me, I look at our drive as a dopamine drive, and it can be for food or can be for comfort. It's not necessarily sexual. And as humans, we have we do select sexually, but I think there's a lot of other things going on because of our difference of consciousness as human beings than just power, sex, money. Yeah, all of that moves the right way. But I think that there is, I don't know, a phenomenon occurring that possibly there's even some ability to manipulate if we understood it better. And with regard to stimulating our dopamine or our addiction, what makes us feel good as individuals, and then leading that into our culture. And my thought comes up with this new thought, and you probably have all heard it, that, there's a lot of new movies out there, TV, that are about, the scammers. Everybody wants to hear about the biggest scam now. There's a Netflix on how this person scammed that person, and this person scammed that person. And, it's stimulating our dopamine to hear about those things, but it's also, it's teaching and creating a love or an interest. It's feeding something that is, not about necessarily trust. And it's more about, how to get away with something, or how to be more self versus other. So to me, that's what comes up for me in listening to this, is just that there is epigenetics happening every day in all of our worlds. It happens because if we don't use it, we lose it. But if we use it, it continues to grow. And this can be emotional or physiological patterns of behavior that we have in us. And that and that maybe one of these runaway things is, I don't know if I'm making much sense now, but that's what my thoughts are about. It's just that if we were to focus and to really consciously, intentionally create a sentience, a value system around, maybe more Eastern value system, we would have, less of a runaway problem. So anyway, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Whenever I think of dopamine or any kind of like mechanism like that, this why does this give us dopamine and not that? The answer to that question is a great hint at biological function in our evolutionary past. And I also just wanted to respond to one thought that is helpful when we're talking about sexual selection, of probably that the cumulative sexual selection of our evolutionary past is far more influential in explaining our behavior than the basically current instantiation of it. And it's an evolving process, and certainly what's happening today is slowly going to affect it. But Steve's point originally of kind of the male ego and what drives it, that's like, well, we're here today as the product of a long time of that, if we took that as true, of occurring. So now, given that, what explains all the things that we do, the fact that that's kind of like a given in our little moment of time of all of that time. So that's like this, even though it's a moving process, because we only live for a brief part of it, so much of it is like we start as given this kind of thing. But thank you for sharing that. It's very interesting. Thank you. And let's go to Diane.
Hi. I'd like to sort of bring things back to our social nature as human beings, and a really key part of that nature is the tendency to form groups, identity groups. So I appreciated Evelyn talking about identity. But it's often an us versus them. And the idea of trust that we were talking about is relevant here, because to identify with a group of people, or to have a social identity, you have to trust that the other people who are participating, who are claiming to be in that group, are trustworthy, right? And so having signals that are costly is a good way to guarantee that. And in the evolution of religion literature, there's a suggestion that having irrational beliefs, claiming to believe in irrational kinds of things, is in fact a trust-producing marker. So if you believe in angels, or you believe in hell or whatever, although there's no evidence for any of these things in our ordinary world, then that helps other people believe that you believe the same things, and so therefore you can be trusted. And a Fisherian runaway that comes to my mind in this context is like what we're seeing in the I guess we could call it the MAGA movement. So that more and more sort of fantastic positions have to be taken in order to prove your membership in that group. So I imagine all of you have better examples in mind than I can come up with, but one of them that occurs to me is the debate over the abortion issue, so that more and more radical restrictions have become part of the membership requirement. So that now you get people who are claiming, you know, I don't want any exceptions. There should be no abortion ever under any circumstances, which is very far from what ordinary people think is common sense. So what do you think about that idea?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the first things that came to my mind when I posed that question to myself of what what are things and what are examples in our life that are, you know, the signal is more important than the thing itself. And I mean, you could certainly say politics at the national level is indemnified by signals, and very little of the signified. I mean, it's basically a game of signaling. And then what actually you go do in the policy side is very disconnected. So I think that sentiment of extreme portrayal of views is, although honest by some people, for the I mean, there's lots of interesting work of showing how the extremist of views are at odds with the relatively mixed of most populations. So it's a great example. Evelyn, did you have your hand up from before, or did you have a new?
Yeah, no, my hand is not up again. Thank you. I'll lower it. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Steve, did you?
I think there's a sort of evolutionary arms race that goes on with signaling that's worth talking about too. We as individual human beings, we are both senders of signals and receivers of signals. And as senders of signals, we all engage in sending false signals and deception. I would commend all of you to read a book by the famous anthropologist Robert Trivers at Rutgers, who wrote a book called The Folly of Fools. The subtitle is The Logic of Deceit and Self-Deception in Human Life. One of the things we're really good about deceiving ourselves about is how much false signaling we actually do, because the way to send convincing false signals is to believe in them yourself. So I think it's at our peril we underestimate the amount of false signaling that goes on. We all feel like we can detect that, right? Because it's adaptive to be able to send false signals. It's also adaptive to be able to detect false signals. And I think it's just worth keeping in mind. We don't want to underestimate the capacity that we have for sending false signals. One of the things that Trivers does in the beginning part of that book is he essentially surveys biology, or at least zoology, and talks about all of the other species in the animal kingdom that have false signals. And it's the height of hubris to think that our species is somehow different and exempt from doing that. So that's I'll stop there.
Yeah. Bob.
So this is very interesting to me. I work on a project called Bridge the Divide to enact Final Five voting in Wisconsin. So when Diane talks about fantastical positions, and Sage used the term politics as a game of signals, both of which I agree with completely, we are about to run an uncontrolled, but nonetheless very interesting and important experiment. If we succeed in implementing Final Five voting in Wisconsin, it will change the environment that our subjects, our politicians, exist in. So they will be beholden to different forces, different inspirations, we expect, even without changing the parties that represent people, that it will change behavior. It will change the environment and therefore change the behavior. And I am, based on this conversation, I am very interested to see how it changes the signaling. I hadn't thought of that until now. But I really believe that that could. We won't, there's no control of this. It's not like it's going to be a well-controlled thing. It will change and will exist in this environment, or it won't change. But if it does, I want to see if these fantastical positions get retrenched, as we believe they will. Politics will still be a game of signaling, but I want to see how those signals change as this environment changes, if we are successful. Thanks.
Wow, that's great. That's a really interesting hypothesis, and I would really hope to that you can follow up with us and share.
Essentially, Bob, what you're talking about is changing the selection pressures.
Yes, because we change the environment.
Yeah.
If we change the environment, the selection pressures change. You're exactly right.
There's something interesting there about kind of the social organization, I think, and the, like it's makes sense that, you know, the national level, I highlighted that relative to, say, local politics, you know, your local town, right? Because there's a level of anonymity to the point that all it is signals. You can't possibly know much about anyone. So signals is you're so dependent on that. At the local level, there's, you know, suddenly you can have like real reputation based on real social networks. You can actually experience trust, even have a relationship with the person, or at least close to people who know them, you know? So, I mean, we have all sorts of opinions on you know, congressmen and or national politicians, but I mean, we don't really have a relationship. And so I think the idea of creating a more sort of a reputational, like I think that would lead to less extreme positions, because people are going to look at you when you say it and be like, really, that's what you believe? When you're shouting into the void to, you know, all of,
Sage,
yeah, please.
oh, do you mind if I add one last comment on this? I think Kathleen asked, this is an instant runoff, but what we're talking about is called Final Five, and it is two parts. It is an open multi-winner primary. That is very important. And it is instant runoff or ranked choice general election. It is essentially the same as what Alaska has implemented. They've implemented Final Four. They just had a special election, and then 3 months later, a scheduled election. So in a way, Alaska has they've had their single data point so far. They will have their second data point coming this November for this change. And I'm keeping very much an eye on it. Not that I'll have a conclusion at that point, but I do want to see where these initial data points are leading us.
Bob, if you have anything you could share for us to maybe follow along with this work, a link or something we could keep tabs on, please feel free to share it in the chat. I think, yeah.
I do locally, and I'll have some national things also.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, I think it's important work. Thanks for sharing. Hank.
Yeah, let's see. The issue I want to look at is, I think Diane mentioned that we have to signal that we believe the same things. And one premise about belonging in a group, it's necessary for survival. Maybe as necessary as finding food or having sex or safety. So if we think of it as a primary imperative, belonging to a particular group, the last thing you want is to not have a group to belong to. So therefore we have, in modern time, we call it loneliness. In the old days, ancient days, it's death or be eaten. So my thinking is, do we think about what are these primary beliefs or views that are used over millennium that sort of count on this primary need to survive through a group? So maybe somebody can word it a little differently, but I find that really, I've always found that interesting, but this discussion is really helping me kind of begin to formulate it in a different way.
Steve, do you have a thought there?
Well, I was just going to say that I think a lot of the political signaling that goes on, and I don't just mean by politicians, I mean by we citizens, whether it's virtue signaling on the left or MAGA signaling on the right, a lot of that is essentially what you're talking about, Hank. It's I believe what you believe, even more than you believe it. That's what virtue signaling is, right?
Mm.
I'm part of the group. A second comment that just occurred to me that it's a little bit off topic, but also the amount of signaling that goes on in social media, which is not something that our evolution anticipated. Talk about new selection pressures. There's an immense amount of false signaling that goes on social media, some of which has been linked in adolescence to incidents of depression and suicide, because people are constantly false signaling that everything in their life is just wonderful and peachy keen, and that's what other people compare to, and they believe the false signals, and they compare their own situation and feel not very good. So talking about signaling and how it goes on in social media is an interesting side street to all of this, I think.
Yeah, one point on that, Steve, it's this funny phenomenon for those who have spent time regrettably on Twitter, is the anonymous accounts are, to my estimation, by far much more honest and personable, and you actually believe the person behind that person. You have a way better sense of who they are, and it's so funny to think of how basically you throw your actual reputation on display with, you use your real name and image and all of that, and you're representing yourself. Yeah, the inadequacy of basically our psychology and the platform itself to give us like adequate ways to, represent ourselves and not be taken the wrong way, not be misconstrued. And so we just do a lot of like signaling and hedging around what we say. So when you just are anonymous, you almost act like you kind of defy all those constraints, and it's very interesting how you would think. That example is like the exact opposite of what I just said with the national politics and the local politics in terms of where reputation flows. You actually remove reputation and you act more honestly. I don't know how to tie that all back together, but
Sage,
yes.
I just
Please,
want to
yeah.
add about the I was thinking of an example, the signaling of individualism, like New Hampshire's license plate, live free or die, or cooperation, like social commons, And these seem to be such basic mechanisms for survival and thriving. And these are sort of used wittingly or for whatever millenniums to signal this is a better way. And if you belong to this group, individualism, live free or die, that's great. Or you belong to the group that cooperates, that's better. And I'm wondering, if we think about over the millennium, which signal has been most predominant in everyday life, in politics? Another thought for consideration.
Yeah. I wanted to maybe offer a slight shift in sort of our conversation here. We've been talking about signaling in large part in terms of selection and the different incentives at play, and sort of, why are you signaling and what are you trying to signal about and what does that do? And we could, I think, holding all of that as very relevant to the process of signaling, I think we can actually, I'm going to make a kind of provocative ontological claim that language itself is signaling, and actually all social information transmission from you to me right now is signaling, for the basic reason that you can never truly know what's in my mind, And as best as I try to tell it to you, to give that to you directly, all I can do is signal it right now through language that approximates basically my thought in my head right now. So the very act of speech, of thought, of communication is, I think, just basically what I'm trying to say is our ontology as social creatures is signaling, and it's not always this separate thing. And I think it really resonates with what Steve was saying of like how far it goes, how much signaling there actually is. I'm basically saying, like, in the sense that we are social species, we learn how to signal to each other so that one person can know what I'm trying to indicate. And language is a profound example of that. It's a signal of our thought itself. And yet you still don't know exactly what it means to me, these words I'm saying or what I'm feeling. And the true meaning, the true informational value is less than always, since you can't read my mind. So I'm glad to see that might have sparked some interest. Diane?
Yeah, on the subject of language, this is one of my favorite little hypotheses that I don't have any real evidence for, but I think it's essential to remember that language is social. In other words, yes, it's a reflection of what the individual is thinking or experiencing, but at the same time, it's a tool that only works if a lot of people use the same signals to mean the same things. But one of the really interesting things about evolution of language is that if you have a restricted group, whether it's geographical restriction or perhaps age restriction or class restriction or whatever, you very quickly get new accents. And I think those accents are also boundary markers. In other words, it's not just expressing your, what shall I call it, internal states or whatever, but it's also telling the hearer about your social position in the world, somehow or another, your class or your education or your point of origin, your nationality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the particularities of language very much reflect group boundaries. That's basically what I wanted to say.
Another signal. Hank, and then Steve.
Yeah, I'd like to make it a little personal because that's so much part of my work. So I'm going to confess what I'm signaling today.
Okay.
And I don't know if this is in the right order, but it's I want to belong. I want to be accepted. I want to be valued. I want to gain status. I want to gain prestige. And one you might not know about is that it's driven in part because in my childhood, much of my excellent qualities or intelligence or wit and stuff like that was really not particularly noticed very much. So I'm trying to make up for lost time.
Well, it's noticed now, Hank, okay?
Thank you. But what I'm getting at is if we think about it, how it's, it's going on every moment, like I think you were saying, or Diane was saying, but it's going on all the time. And in my work, we're trying to pay attention to, since I've been doing this with you guys, it's really changed a lot about how I see my work. Because right now I stopped really listening to psychotherapy lectures and books, and I listen to the stuff that we're doing. And it's so much bigger than the signaling amongst the competing tribes in the fields of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. I mean, there's too many of them now. So I thank you all for allowing me to grow as well. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you. Steve and then Kathleen.
I just had two thoughts again. I always seem to start by saying I had two thoughts. One is, Sage, I agree with what you said a few moments ago about all language essentially is signaling. I would add to that, though, let's not forget the hardwired nonverbal signaling that we come into the world with. Babies are fantastic at signaling what they want. And I'm sure all of us know the research on facial recognition of emotions, different emotional states, which are cross-cultural. So Mother Nature and evolution has prepared us to come as master signalers even before we learn to do it verbally. The other thought I had as you were talking about using language to signal to others to the best of your ability who you are inside, if you will. I also think at times we use language to signal to ourselves who we are. That sometimes in talking to other people or in writing, which in the context you're describing it is sending signals. That's how we clarify. And in a way, Hank, maybe that's what goes on in psychotherapy is I'm sending signals to a therapist in an effort not to figure out who the therapist is, but to discover myself.
Good points, and thanks for going even deeper in terms of the depths of signaling and how far it goes.
Hank is signaling that he's an iPhone user instead of an Android user.
What are we all signaling right now by being here? I can't help but look at these hands and be like, what do they signal? Kathleen?
Well, once again, my comments have been preempted by the last person. I was going to say something similar to what Steve just said, because, I started out as a preschool teacher and studied child development and was a therapist. And in a sense, we can't see the forest for the trees when it comes to language being signaling. Life doesn't exist without the signaling that is required in nurturing young life. And the more we move away from, asexual reproduction, the more we're going to be getting into the inherent emergent necessity of signaling from the moment that life begins and even before that. So that babies are really good at reading, they evolve, but all of that stuff is just a quality of group life. And somebody made a comment earlier about the competition between the live free or die, or the individualism versus cooperation kind of cultural motifs. I do think that the group, what we're touching on, group identity and group cohesion, we only exist in groups. We only exist with other people. And it's just a question of defining, what's our group, and then what are the groups that are becoming more successful. So I think that's where this is an interesting question to maybe pick up at another time is what are those signals that we can, that are influencing the networks of groups in human culture that are taking us in a certain direction. I'd like to think that it's not just about power, control, and dominance, but it sure looks that way this morning watching BBC News. Check.
Beautifully put, and an extremely important point about our group nature. There are no individual humans. They died as infants or went insane from lack of language. Let's give Evelyn the final word here, and then and just in the last couple of minutes, just posted these links again in case you haven't signed up for any reason. I think everyone here has, but just in case. And then if you haven't already, I think there's a couple people who haven't. Please click on that vote link and just give your 2 cents there on the voting process. Evelyn, did you want to?
Yeah, I just will leave you all with the thought of, I think you called it the Fisherian, when things go downhill because of the signaling process. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm a physician, so I work with, a lot of medical assistants and nurses. And in the last year or so, I've just watched this incredible evolution of fake eyelashes. It's really amazing. And they get bigger and they get bigger and they get bigger. And I don't know what the signaling is. I mean, and culturally it might be there's a lot of Filipinos, but there's a lot of Latina X, there's everybody. I mean, it's not the usual white upper class demographic that's a medical assistant, but there's just something about this and it causes eyelash allergies. It causes all kinds of horrible things to put these fake eyelashes on, but there's some kind of signaling happening here. I mean, of course it's anti-aging and facelifts and everything else too, I suppose. But I just was thinking, well, what is the dissolution of, what is one of these things? And I just thought, oh, those eyelashes, that's got to be one, something about that. So that's what I'm just thinking of. And that's simple, and there. It's been a very delightful time today. I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thanks for that that very memorable example here. Okay, so I'm just going to take a quick look at these voting results so that we have it on record together. Let's see. All right, so it looks like lots of interest in all of these, so I think we'll definitely circle them. We'll bring them back in around, but next session, let's take some time to focus on convergent evolution and all of its many forms. Thanks to Rob for suggesting that, and yeah, but all there's a margin of 1 vote here, so we will see these topics again for sure. All right, thank you all, and we'll meet again on November 3rd if you want to add that to your calendars now, and I'll share it again over the email. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Sage.
Thank you.
Sage, bye, everybody.
Thank you.